Hello and welcome to the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Yes, I am an actual magician. And in this 30th episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the world of occult book writing, occult book publishing, and give you some behind the scenes information, just from my perspective at least. In this video, I'm going to cover problems with publishers, getting a book cover. I'm going to be covering the book that took the most work and doesn't really sell, which is Gregorian Angels, and some of the reasons behind that, perhaps. I'm going to be talking about what happens when a book gets translated, in this case, one of our books into Japanese. I'm going to be talking about what happens when a book doesn't sell as well as the publisher expects. For example, Tarot Face to Face. I'm going to be talking about my favourite book out of the books that I've written and have written with my co-author Tali Goodwin. I'm going to be talking about the book that I actually use the most and the reasons why and why it's practical and the reasons why I like practical books that are based on experience. I'm going to be talking about the first book I ever did write, The Magician's Kabbalah, and the history with that. And I'm going to be talking about the first mass market published book that we wrote that won the COVR Visionary Award winner, which is around the Tarot in 78 Days. And I'm going to be talking mainly about that in terms of approaching a publisher, getting a publishing deal, and so forth. So all of this is just based on my personal experience, of course, so your mileage may vary. But I'm going to start at the very beginning. And I mentioned this in a previous video, but I do have it framed, and it's a letter from Llewellyn, and I love Llewellyn. They are our favourite publisher. We do a lot of work with them. We've written parts of other books for them. We've been called in, certainly I was called in to write the Abramelin section of the complete ceremonial magick at the last minute. So I think everyone else had about a year to write theirs, and I had about 8 weeks to write mine. So we trust them to work with, we have good communications with them and so forth. But it was not always so. Back in 1995, I submitted my first book to Llewellyn. I was 28, I was about 26 to 27 when I wrote it. I submitted it when I was about 28. They sent me back a full write-up of it, which was really useful. It was about 30 pages from another Llewellyn author who was already versed in Kabbalah. I don't know who it was or what their background was, but they proofread it, edited a lot of stuff, just factual clarifications and things like that, which was really useful. And I spent a long time rewriting it. I then sent the book back to Llewellyn, and this was pre-internet, so it was all by post, so it's taking weeks to get to them and then months for them to get back. Then what happened was they said that they were interested in publishing it. I was really struggling financially at the time, and I was spending a lot of time trying to actually work full time, but also break into publishing to become an author that I'd always wanted to be ever since I was very young. And I'll show you some pictures of me. I was always writing, and my dad very kindly took photos of me writing because he could see it was a passion of mine. My dad also was the person who bought me the 3 Encyclopedia of the Tarot as they came out, and Dungeons and Dragons, and really supported me very much in my writing, which was to become a great boon as I got older. Then what happened was they got back to me, Llewellyn got back to me and said, well, we're definitely interested, we're going to publish it, however, we need it rewritten in a particular format. And this is one thing about writing for publishers. Make sure you understand their guidelines and work to their guidelines. You have no special superpowers to get round their guidelines, to break the mold, to write how you want or anything. If you're working with the publisher, you work with their guidelines. One of Llewellyn's, I don't know if it's a written guideline, but it's certainly one we've learned over the years, is consistency. If every chapter starts with a quote, then every chapter must start with a quote. If every section heading starts with something personal or a particular style of writing, then every single section has to start like that. Consistency, consistency, consistency. I had typed, I think I was using an Amiga word processor system on an old Amiga at the time, because obviously this was just as computers were coming out as well. I was ahead of the curve because I worked in computing. And so I spent 3 months when I should have been working, rewriting this proposal, draft, and formatting it, and I sent it to them, and then I didn't hear back for ages, for months and months and months. And then on June 27th, or it would have been July, August by the time it got to me, 1995, I received this letter, which says, "Thank you for the opportunity to consider your manuscript titled The Magician's Kabbalah. We are sorry to have to reject it after serious consideration, but we have concluded that it does not suit our current needs. This was also because a number of other Kabbalah books had come out, also merging sort of quantum science, quantum physics, some of the new ideas that were percolating in the sort of popular sphere in the mid-90s, early 90s, but rather the fact that as a specialised publisher, we receive thousands of proposals every year and currently publish only 76 titles yearly, including our annuals. We wish you the best of luck and would welcome the opportunity to consider future works." So they left it open. That was nice. However, I didn't receive the letter certainly the way it was intended, because I was so despairing, so angry, so tired and exhausted, and I swore I would never ever write a book again. It wasn't worth it, that it was a waste of time, that I would never trust a publisher ever again. Ironically, the amount of work we have enjoyed doing with Llewellyn and the good relations we have with Llewellyn ever since, but for a few days, I would never have thought that a bit later on I would be submitting books and even publishing The Magician's Kabbalah. So back then, it put me off writing, I think, this letter for about 5 years. I just couldn't write. I just could not write. I couldn't bring myself to do it. All sorts of other changes happened in my life around the time. And the years went on. So I now have this framed and I put it over there. So as you can see, as I walk into the library here to sit down to write, I always see this as I walk in. And it's a good reminder that you shouldn't give up on things. Even if it takes a longer time than you might think, you really shouldn't give up on things. And The Magician's Kabbalah, I think I put a note in for the date, 20 years later, I actually self-published The Magician's Kabbalah with a lot of editing, with a lot of changes to it, but this was basically the original manuscript that I'd submitted, and it took 20 years before it came to publication. And I'm pleased with this in the fact that I know it's an early piece of writing that I did. This is not the first book that I published or was published, but it's the first bit of writing I did, and it sort of holds up. I would want to change a few things maybe in retrospect. I did change a few things, but it was how I saw Kabbalah at the time. So this is even though it was published in where did I write it was published? 2015. In 2015, this was actually written in 1993, something like that. And I still stand by it, even though obviously this published version is not quite the original draft. It's a little bit tidier, and it has some quaint ideas in it that I might clarify these days, but I would still stick by them. So that's the Magician's Kabbalah, and the story behind receiving a rejection letter and then using that as something positive, as some advice that your book, perhaps, or your manuscript or your idea doesn't quite fit the current market, but that's not to say it might not fit another market. It might not fit that particular publisher. That's not to say it's not going to fit for another publisher. It might not be time to produce it yet. We have an example of a book that has been put back several years because the market isn't quite ready for it. There isn't enough interest or enough of a surge in that, which I guess brings me to one of our best-selling titles. You might be surprised given that we've got maybe 40, 50 books out there, but I don't know if you can guess what our best-selling product or title is. It is actually the Easy Lenormand kit with the French cartomancy deck, published by Llewellyn, and it comes in a nice little box, so it goes well on the shelves in the bookshops, and it includes a 36 card deck and a 168 page book, which is actually a slightly tweaked, streamlined version of our book Learning Lenormand. And I like to perhaps talk about this because this is our best-selling little kit, little book, little piece of writing, deck and research. But at the time that we popularized the Lenormand, which I think I've spoken about in other videos, in order to get the Lenormand out there so we could use the symbolism of the rose and the key, it was really badly received by a lot of our detractors and haters out there who'd have believed that you could have tarot haters, but we certainly had our fair share of them back in the day when we were first starting out, and they were really intent on stopping us reaching our audience, teaching anything, sharing things. They were review bombing stuff. On the forums, it was a free-for-all. They were doing all sorts of things, and it was only a fairly small group of people, but they had different reasons not to like us, I guess. But this ended up and is still our best-selling title. So again, don't let your detractors, or even friends and family for that matter, tell you what isn't right for you to do, because the audience, the market, will actually decide what they want to buy, and the publishers will respond to that, of course. So this is our best-selling popular title, Easy Lenormand. So from that early example of a rejection letter and my despair at receiving it and my subsequent decision to stop writing for a while, I stopped writing for 5 years, and then I wrote for magazines and things like that, occult magazines for quite a while. The Lamp of Thoth, Chaos International, actually has one of the first computer programs written for occultism, and that's mine under a pseudonym in there. I wrote sort of visionary material, channeling type stuff, all sorts of things for those early magazines. So I really cut my teeth on writing short form articles. Then at some particular point, I was approached to be asked if some of my teaching methods that I was teaching in workshops at the time would make a good book for a new publisher out in Thailand. And I don't want to talk too much about that, but it went to hell in a handbasket over a number of years, and it resulted eventually in me getting the rights back to my own work so that I could self-publish them. So that was Terosophy, which was my first real published book, and this was edited very well by the publisher, and it's really tight, and it is where we got the tagline, Marcus Gatz has recovered the spiritual dignity of tarot, by Naomi Zaniak, who I eventually got to meet last year and was able to complete a long sort of circle to actually thank her for that tagline. And we had the tagline, tarot to engage life, not escape it. And I originally sent this to Mary K. Greer, Lon, Milo Duquette and Rachel Pollack, because those were the names that I wanted to look at the book, and to really, what I asked them was, is this all new stuff? I didn't want to, for myself at least, publish something that had already been written about before. And they very kindly said that it's very new, it's very groundbreaking, it's a new way of looking at the tradition of tarot and so forth, which was very kind of them. Mary, I think, pointed out that one of my methods that was unique and original in here was actually found in Papus, I think, and I went back to Papus, and sure enough, he'd done it already, and he'd done a better job of it, so I took that out and replaced it with something entirely new from my own experience and the way I was reading tarot at the time. Now, that is now republished, and so you can find copies of this. I only have 2 copies of the Salamander and Sons version of this, and once I got the rights back to it, I just republished it. But it's exactly the same book. It's laid out slightly differently, but obviously it's the same book. And so this is my heart and soul of tarot put into a book, and the name Tarosophy, which came from a magical working from the back of the Abramelin book, from the magical squares. I was after a magical name, and the name Tarosophy came to me. I found out no one had used it before, so I trademarked it, because you can't trademark the title of a book, which is hence why there's so many beginner books to tarot called Beginner Books to Tarot. So I trademarked it, and that came from a magical square that was to know the secret of names. And I hadn't seen that bit of it when I actually had the idea come to mind, because I was looking at the magical squares for actual words in the squares themselves to tag on to tarot in order to make it something unique, as something I could trademark. My style would have a name, and that is now Tarosophy itself. Now, that also had led to a further idea, which was to publish something called the Magister. Now, a lot of this material came from my MA research in Western Esotericism at the University of Exeter, but also my practical stuff as well. And I wanted to publish a homage to the Equinox publications and publish this as volume 0 of what were a planned 11 volumes. And you can see perhaps the amount of footnotes at the start of this. I wanted to make it absolutely tight and throw into it everything that I'd read over the sort of 30, 40 years, everything that I thought was important, just in case if I get hit by a bus, at least I've got all of my ideas written down in a book for tarot book. Then the Magister was meant to be, if I get hit by a bus, at least all of the reading I bothered doing over the years won't be wasted. There'll be a list of the books I think are important for whatever that might be worth to anyone else. And I've no illusions that it would be worth that much to a lot of people, but I certainly wanted it for myself at least to have all of my ideas in one place where I could refer to them, all of the research into the very earliest forms of the grade system. Again, this is a lot from my MA research. A lot of this comes from libraries and museums and institutions around the world. And some of it comes from my aborted PhD work, of which I spent about 4 or 5 years working on before deciding that it would be better in a book than necessarily a paper that was then the property of the university and therefore couldn't be published as is. unless it was published in a very, very expensive, exclusive academic volume. But I also wanted a load of practical stuff in, so there's the Fourth Way work. Now, at the moment, Charlotte Louise and I are rewriting this, retweaking it to make it more streamlined, but it will be produced hopefully later in 2025. This is part of the life of a jobbing author, really, is deciding what projects you're going to be working on, how long they're going to take, whether they're going to be financially viable because you still have to pay the bills. And something like this actually cost me money for the research, for the time, for everything else, and is highly unlikely to ever make any money back in terms of the expense that went into writing and researching it. But again, this is going to be a core book and part of the 11 volumes. Again, in terms of the life of a jobbing author, then I have got notes for all 11 volumes, and every now and again I do a bit of work on each of them. And so what it means is once we've done the first one, which will actually be called Volume 1, it was very pretentious to call it Volume 0, and then have to keep saying that's the first book in the series is Volume 0, when in fact you need to make it easy for the reader. A groundbreaking concept, but you actually need to make it easy for the reader to understand what you're doing and call it Volume 1 if it's Volume 1 in a series, and not try and be, it's Volume 0, the order of revelation, the worker enters the workshop. I'll keep some of that, but this I want to be magic in history, theory and practice, again, with a big nod, as you can see, to the Equinox publications of Aleister Crowley, and the sort of layout of it. We're just moving things around. In effect, this book it goes into, say, alchemy, the grade system, and talks about the tarot and the grade system and so on. And basically each section is a section, and then it goes through the Kabbalah of that particular section, the grades of that particular theme, and so on, and looks at the grade system through different themes. The problem is the Malkuth bit, or the Zelator bit, the beginner's bit, is at the start of each section, and so you'd have to collate them all together, which again it's the way I see it, the way I wanted to write it and so forth, but not necessarily that easy for an absolute beginner to then pick out the bits in each section that are going to be relevant to them. It's exactly the same in magic and theory and practice, that there are repeats thematically of certain things under certain themes. So if you're interested in Malkuth or the Zelator work or a particular grade or a particular experience, you have to pick that bit out from each of the sections. And I see it as a sort of longitudinal slice and delivery of things. So what we're doing with this is, in effect, we're picking out all of the beginner bits, the Zelator bits, the Malkuth bits in each section, and putting those at the front. And then, in effect, the grade will be the theme, and all of the themes will belong inside that grade. And then we're going along and doing the same with the Yesod stuff, the dream stuff, the psychological stuff, the intermediate stuff, and the exercises. We're picking those out of those themes and then putting them in the second section, and so on. So basically we're sort of filleting the book and reordering it whilst keeping most of the same content. There'll be some new content, some slightly new content for those who've already got this or my self-published version of it, the previous version. And but basically it'll be reorganized and streamlined into more of a workbook, sort of, although it will still have a nod to the Equinox. And then the next book, Volume 2 of the Magister, will follow, far more concentrating on things like the Fourth Way work, dream work, astral travel, all of the path working stuff, some of which will be taken out of this for a far bigger expansion. And I've got a load of material that isn't in this on dream work in particular. They'll be in the second volume, and the third volume will go into theories of thought, the magical mind, building of habit, will, all of that side of things, the HOD side of things, and the Tree of Life will be in the third volume, and so forth, about which I'm currently doing a load of reading and a load of referencing, but that won't be applicable for another probably 3 years before we get to write that one. The idea was to write one a year and produce them once a year, so that's still the plan for the new version. So then we have our first actual published book back with Llewellyn, and this is through an agent. And our agent at Llewellyn is, we've met her several times, talked to her a lot about publishing and so forth. And Tali had the idea of a Jules Verne cover for this, and Llewellyn were very receptive to our cover ideas. Quite often they ask for the author's cover idea, their concept, and they might ignore it completely, but sometimes they will go with it. And the colouring is often blue and gold, which just tends to signify spiritual things, as you can see on the spines of a lot of books, and why, for example, you'll notice Teosophy is blue and gold. It's just a common usage of colouring on the covers. And just to by the by, it was Shiro Marchetti I contacted for the cover of the original version of this, because I wanted this image, particularly with the full, with all of the cards being part of the Fool's bag, in effect, coming out of the box here. And I had seen this in a dream, literally seen this in a dream, and contacted Shiro, and that started a good relationship working with Shiro Marchetti over the years, particularly when it came to the Le Monde. So again, sometimes it's really important to reach out to people and see if you can collaborate with them. So agent for this wanted a beginner's book from us. They were slightly worried, based on Teosophy, which was the only book I'd obviously published at that point, that my writing might be a bit too academic or a bit too dry. This is a very different book to this. I should actually show you the current version of Teosophy, not the old one. So Teosophy is a very different book to this, and that's partly because I co-wrote this with Tali Goodwin, who has a unique, quirky, more accessible style. Mine tend to read in draft form like manuals, although I can wax lyrical on occasion. They tend, my natural way of thinking is very orderly. Tali's is far more chaotic and off-piste, and so that gives a very unique, quirky terms, references, styles of delivery and ideas. So the whole idea of a Jules Verne around the Tarot in 78 Days came from Tali, and a lot of the exercises came from her as well, and some of the far more quirky writing on the cards. Yeah, so in terms of co-authoring, it's always very different for different books, for different requirements, and with different co-authors as well. The way I might work with Tali would be very different to anyone else. And we have here the ancient Colosseum, for example, as Gate 7, and you can see we were already sticking the idea of gates in, because we were already working on what was to become Arcatia, the symbol of the gates. In effect, what we've been trying to do over the years is build a tarot cinematic universe. I love the idea in the first Marvel film, when Nick Fury comes into the bar at the end, and you suddenly realise that, hang on, this film might be talking about another film, that they're going to build something. And back then it wasn't quite as obvious what a success that was going to be. And so even back then we started to build in ideas that would interlink between materials and media as well. So some of our Arcatia stuff actually appears in a little publication I did for Call of Cthulhu role-playing games. It's available on Drive-Thru RPG, and there's a scene in a particular module that I've written called The Staircase, where there's a direct reference to Arcadia and to a scene in Arcadia. There are things in the Magister that refer to things in Arcadia and so forth. So we've been building this sort of weird cinematic tarot universe over the years for some later project. We don't know what that is yet, but we'll be sure to share it when we do. So that's then very nicely won an award because it's perhaps a different way of delivering the tarot than had been seen before. We've got things like how to turn any question into a spread. And again, what we tried to do was make things unique, make things interesting, mix things up a bit. Main regret with this book would be that we went with our Kabbalistic inclinations, or my Kabbalistic inclinations, to write the book in order of ascent of the Tree of Life, and hence the gates in it. And this, for example, Gate 4, the Garden of Delights, refers to Hesed, perhaps, and so forth. And a lot of people then pointed out, quite rightly, that as a reference book, it then becomes slightly annoying. It's very nice if you're working through it day by day, as intended for the book, but then its utility as a reference book means that you have to go to the beginning, find the card, and then find the page. You can't just flip in and then go, oh, here's the Five of Pentacles, the Six of Pentacles will come next. And in retrospect, going with that, it doesn't ruin the book or anything, but it is something that reduces its utility as a reference book, but it is intended as a course book for self-study and not a reference book. But again, it's not necessarily clear that this is going to be difficult as a reference book. And talking of clarity, which book do you think you would buy if you were faced with these two books? So Tarot Face to Face, using the cards in your everyday life, and we've got a mirror there. I don't know if it's clear that it's a mirror, but that's a mirror design. Or Practical Tarot Techniques, your essential toolkit. I'm reading off the screen in front of me here. Your essential toolkit for better readings with a picture of the cards on. So which book do you think would be a better seller than the other? Well, the answer is that they're both the same book. We had this brilliant idea that Tarot Face to Face would be literally for face-to-face readings and readers. And so all of the methods in here, like always set a time limit for readings, arrange for and take payment in advance, agree on attendance number in advance. Every single method in here is actually not necessarily the ones that are in here, but these are far more from our practical experience of doing real readings for real people in real situations, whether that's to an aggressive group of drunks in a bar, whether it's to a corporate event, whether it's to friends and family, whether it's at a psychic fair in a field, wherever it may be, we've had experience of it. And all of my tricks and techniques in particular are in here. And I really love this book. I think this one is one of my favourite ones. It's got the Finding Possibilities method that has since become a hit on Instagram. If people don't quite understand the actual real method underneath it, how to deal with intense questions, love and relationship questions, really practical everyday stuff. But it didn't sell that well. It didn't sell as well as we were expecting. And so eventually Llewellyn allowed it to go out of print and then just simply retitled it Practical Tarot Techniques, your essential toolkit for better readings, and put tarot cards on the front, not this abstract mirror. And the back blurb is slightly different. So this one, Master the Tarot Cards, well, Master the Tarot Cards might not be what people are after, but discover easy, smart and creative ways to improve your readings in every situation is a far better way of putting it than for insightful readings in everyday situations. You don't necessarily need insightful readings in there. It's far better to say improve your readings in every situation. And you'll notice the font is different here. This is far more rarefied and occult and magical, whereas this is more friendly, accessible, handwritten font in between and so forth. And so that sells really well, or relatively well, and this hardly sold at all. So again, but it's the same book, and it's usually made clear on Amazon, although some people have complained that it isn't as clear as they might want. But it is, I think it's, it does say this book was previously published as Tarot Face to Face. But obviously that's inside, and very few people read all of that stuff. They just get straight into the book, of course. But that's just one good example, again, from the life of a jobbing author, that sometimes the cover and the title can be the big difference. And the whole idea about don't judge a book by the cover may be true in a metaphorical sense, but it certainly isn't true in a from the buyer's point of view. And if you're publishing books, you want people to buy them. It's as simple as that. And so therefore, it isn't true that you can judge a book